thank the organizers who brought this event together. I know it takes a lot of time, energy, and space away from families. So thanks to the folks who are joining us, and thank you to the folks who organized. We are on the traditional lands of the Duwamish and Suquamish people. And I acknowledge that we are on those traditional lands of the first people of Seattle and a city named after the Duwamish chief, Chief Sealth. And we honor the Duwamish people past and present and honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe, the Suquamish tribe, Muckleshoot, Tulalip, Nisqually, and Puyallup, and all the tribes upon whose lands and waterways we traverse. And I recommend that folks do what they can to take our land acknowledgements and have them meet action. One way to do that is to become a real renter with Real Rent Duwamish. And we also want to acknowledge that the first City Council of Seattle, Washington criminalized Duwamish people and their presence here in 1865. And so doing the work of defunding the police, of believing in a world beyond prisons and police is a pro-Indigenous fight and is inextricably interconnected with our fight for Black liberation.
Thank you so much, Nikita. I'm gonna go ahead and pass it on to Trey to take us through our agenda today. And as folks speak, if you can give just a brief introduction to who you are for the folks who have not had a chance to meet you.
I'm Trey. I am with Black Action Coalition and a few other orgs. I'm a 29-year-old Black woman that's from Seattle. And I came to the streets because I saw there was a need for people being on the streets fighting for what's right. So today our agenda will go over our general update, which is what we want in 2020. And then we're gonna go to grounding our analysis. And then after that, we'll do the fight in 2021. We will have workshops and breakout rooms. I'll be leading a breakout room, so I'm excited to get to see some of y'all and interact with some of y'all. And then we'll actually have some calls to action and definitely ways that you can plug in and help. If we all do a little bit, it doesn't have to be the whole brunt of just everything on the shoulders of, just the same group. So if all of us, do a little bit of work, we can probably just get there to where we want to get to even further. Even quicker. So that's the agenda.
Thank you all so much. So we're really excited to get started today with a special guest, Sheila from Reclaim the Block. I will let Sheila tell you a little bit more about herself, but she is someone who has been on the ground in Minneapolis since the beginning of this uprising last summer. And we wanted to make sure to connect our fights to the fights that were spurred by the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. So I'm going to pass it over to Sheila.
Hi, y'all. It is so good to be with you today. My name is Sheila. I use she, her pronouns, coming in from Dakota land in Minneapolis. And what to say? So I'll share what happened last Sunday here, which is we came together at George Floyd Square, which is the corner of 38th in Chicago, where George Floyd was murdered, and held a festival that we called the People's Power Love Fest. And at it, we crossed the finish line to collecting the required 20,000 signatures for us to put forward a ballot amendment that would remove the police from our city's charter, which is essentially our city's constitution, and replace it with a Department of Public Safety that would use a holistic approach to public safety that doesn't default to police. So what we're doing this year is hosting a series of people's movement assemblies where we can learn from different communities, different neighborhoods, building up to citywide, to see what does safety mean to different communities and how can we make this new department meet the real needs of wellness and safety for people in the city in Minneapolis. And I got connected with Angelica and so many of the amazing organizers in Seattle earlier this summer, and it became clear to me how important it is for us to be communicating in these fights, because we found that even though it feels so hyper local to our city council or our police chief or whatever, that we were facing the same kind of pushback and also had similar dreams of what we were fighting for participatory budgeting, for moving social service functions outside of the police where they never should have been, and exchanging strategies too, right? So one important example I have, and then I'll wrap up, is we saw in Minneapolis, so we got our city council to commit to defunding the police and saying that the Minneapolis Police Department could not be reformed. We made them read those words. And after that, our police staged a slowdown. They stopped responding to calls in the areas of those council members who came out and spoke against them. And we shared this with folks in Seattle, and I think that it was helpful for you all too, as you were doing some planning, to have that on your radar. And so, yeah, I'm so excited to be connected with you all, and excited for your workshop today, and I will turn it back over to the organizers.
And you are muted, Angelica, so give me a second. And I will need you to be in present view for your slides so that they'll be nice and big for us. All right, let's give that a try. So, all right, do you see a button pop up? That was my bad. Thank you, Angelica.
No worries. Okay, I'm gonna go into present mode, but then I think I lose the rest of my screen. So I might need someone else to share the slides so that I can see my notes at the same time. Thank you all for bearing with us as we figure out this brave new Zoom Live world. All right, so I actually want to pass it over to Trey to talk about the connection with the work that we were able to win in terms of City Council. The picture you see behind this slide is a march on City Council to deliver the 3 demands the last summer. But we know that nothing that we gained in terms of the initial wins from City Council and the mayor would have happened without the work on the ground. And so I want to give Trey a sec to talk about that. Maybe we can switch over slides to someone who is not me.
All right, hi, again, I am Trey. Thank you so much, Angelica, and then Sheila as well too, for passing it over to me. I did want to make sure to mention that the reason why there were so many people on the streets were because of an incident that did happen in Minneapolis, when we saw Black men slaughtered on national news, all over social media and so forth. And as someone who has dealt with brutalizing of SPD, I felt it was just in my power or my duty really to just go to the streets and really use my voice, which is very important. There were thousands of folks that were in the streets, and we literally could have not gotten the 20% if it wasn't for people being super dedicated to coming to the streets. You can call city council members all you want, which is great. You can give public comment, which is great. You can talk to your neighbors, which is great. But on the ground presence is the reason why movements move. This country that was, stolen from our Indigenous brothers and sisters started as a protest. So on the ground work does work. And it's important to make sure that we are holding space for folks that are on the ground and not making it difficult. I know many of marches I've been on, we have blocked traffic. We have, maybe, made it a little bit harder for people to get on with the Friday evening, but there are still Black people that continue to be slaughtered. There are still Indigenous women that continue to go missing. And it's important that when we're on the ground that we're, holding up that space, but really just talking about what is going on. And later I'll be in a workshop talking about ways in which you can still, come into the streets and still, have a voice and really utilize that voice while you're there. So it's really important to just know of all those thousands of folks that were on the streets, that were either in CHOP and that were in the streets after, they're super passionate about what it is that they were doing, because it's literally being on the right side of history. And I know it's probably just not the best as far as people trying to, go on about their day. But until there is Black liberation, until there's Indigenous sovereignty, you will continue to see folks out on the streets. And I just want to again thank Sheila for being here, because, the work that they are doing in Minneapolis really did help, kind of transpire all the work that was going on a national level, but even worldwide as well too, because there were not uprisings just in Seattle and Minneapolis. It was literally around the world. And we have to continue to make sure that we are on the streets until, there is freedom. So I just wanted to add that in there.
All right, thank you so much, Trey. And so thank you also to whoever is now sharing the slides that is not me. Clearly, I cannot do too many things at once. If we can move down to the slide that says, all right, if we can move down to the slide that says, what did we win? So we wanted to spend a few minutes grounding ourselves in what actually came of these efforts last year and the efforts that continue. As Trey says, people continue to march every single week. And so I'm going to go into some detail, and we'll be sending a follow-up email to you all with the link to these slides, with more links to more information. So if you want to utterly nerd out on this, we welcome that, and we welcome you to join us. So I'll just hop into by the numbers, right? So in 2020, before the uprising, SPD's budget going into that year was $409 million, which was nearly a quarter of the city's entire general fund. So that's what the money the city has to do everything that a city is supposed to do. 25% of that almost went to SPD, between SPD and the police pensions. This year, SPD went into the year with $362 million in their budget. Just that shift from 409 to any number below, a number that is substantially less, is huge. We have never seen a decreased budget in SPD. Every year since SPD was founded, the budget has just grown and grown and grown and grown, and it would have continued to be that way, but for the derailing that we did last year to get this train of, funding racist anti-Black policing off the tracks. In terms of what actually was cut, we saw $35 million in actual cuts. So that's money that just left the SPD budget, never to return if we keep fighting. So that was 35 layoffs, out of order layoffs that are supposed to happen, defunding of positions that were already vacant. So people were not doing that work, but SPD still had the money, and then cuts to overtime and training. So we will be talking about that as cuts, as basically eliminations from SPD's budget. Then we saw another $40 million in transfers. So this was money that no longer exists in SPD because those functions moved to another city department. So it's SPD functions, SPD employees out of SPD to other departments. If we look at that number and you add that up, it doesn't actually add up to the 362 million, and that's because SPD actually got some money added to their budget last year, and that was just like the general cost of living increases, new staff for the Office of Police Accountability, basically to process all of the complaints from SPD brutalizing protesters last year, and then a couple of other things like more tech to like have more of those traffic cameras. So it wasn't a total, like everything that was cut isn't reflected because of some natural, or I would say unnatural gains that happened. So altogether, we got an 11% defund if you take what was added and what was subtracted away. So that's just sort of like if we're looking at 50% as our goal, we got 11% of the way there. Can we go to the next slide? All right, so what actually got eliminated from the budget? So eliminated funding for 154 positions, and this is huge because those are 154 cops that cannot be hired because the money is gone for them. We got a $3.7 million cut in overtime funding. Again, SPD's overtime budget on its own is bigger than the budget for about a quarter of the city's entire departments or agencies. So any cut to that was a move in the right direction. Cuts to travel and training budgets. Again, SPD will often tell us that if only they had the right kind of training, they would stop killing Black folks. We know that's not true, so we're going to continue to go after these trainings. Cuts in discretionary funding, as well as cuts to civilian vacancies. And so that's where that $35 million comes from. Yeah, someone's asking if these slides will be available. Absolutely. And if you totally want to go nerd out, we put the source there and you can look. SPD finally posted their budget for the year. So you can look at that on your own. Let me go to the next slide. Okay, so why does this matter? Why do these numbers matter other than like we fought and we won and we've derailed the train of like SPD growing exponentially every year without stopping? So that's one, but the other is that we actually reduced the position authority. All of these are terms that like I had no idea about, many people didn't before we took on this fight last year, but the position authority is how many cops can actually be hired, right? So last year in 2020, SPD was funded to hire 1,497 cops. This year we got the position authority down to 1,357 cops. And so that is as far as SPD can grow this year. And we are trying to keep bringing that number further and further and further down. Now, in terms of how many they were actually funded to hire, and it's really important here to note that this is a place where we didn't win. SPD and the mayor together said, this is how many cops, if we give it all our best, we think we can hire this year. And so please fund us for that entire number. That number was 1343. And council went ahead and did that. It's super notable, though, that in the past, they had funded them for 150 extra cops above what they could even, if they tried their best, hire. And so that's where we basically cut all of the, like extra fat from SPD's budget. And that's why they're coming back now and calling this a staffing crisis or a budget crisis, because they've never had to work within a budget where, like any other city department, where you're actually just budgeted for the work that you actually can do. So getting those 140 positions eliminated, that's something we're going to have to fight to hold on to. But again, council still funded them to hire everyone that they possibly could hire in terms of armed officers. Right now, the current number of deployable officers on the force is 1,075. Can you go to the next slide? Let's see. So that means that this is how many cops could be on the streets right now, 1,075, but they're funded this year for 1,343 cops, which means that they are doing some aggressive recruiting and hiring efforts right now. We won't have too much time to go into the no new cops push, but right now what we're trying to do is make sure that we are not just shrinking the department, but also interrupting the hiring pipelines in any ways that we can. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that we don't just want to shrink the police department by retirements. We also want to shrink it by stopping new hires. The other thing, so thank you for moving on to the next slide. So further cuts were also promised, but those are under threat, right? So everything I've talked about were things that were actually cut. And then council, because again of all of our efforts, everyone being on the streets, calling in, doing public comment, making it politically impossible for them to do anything but this, they put in a $5 million proviso that was championed by Council President Gonzalez, where she said, well, we don't know actually, even though we're funding SPD to hire up to 1,343 cops, we don't know if they're going to be able to do that. And also cops might leave and we might have salary savings there. So every quarter, we as a council are going to come back. And if there's salary savings from cops leaving and new cops not being hired, we're going to take that money and put it into participatory budgeting, which Sean talked about. So great, we were like, awesome, provisos in. What happened a couple of weeks ago is that council came back and proposed a substitute bill, a bill that would remove that proviso altogether and just say, we'd rather not pick that fight with SPD. So now we have to come back and say, no, we're all still here, we're still looking. You put that proviso in place and it has to stay in place. The other thing we won last year in December, one of the big wins in the summer was this pushback to the idea of overtime. Despite the fact that SPD has this giant, like tens of millions of dollar overtime budget, every year they go over it. And every year until last year, they would get paid back by council and by the mayor at the end of the year. So they would just present a bill for the overtime they went over by a lot, and council would always pay up. Now, last summer, council said, no, we're going to stop doing that. Passed a resolution and said no more overage on the overtime. But then at the end of the year, SPD still came back and asked for an extra 5.4 million. Council did pay that out, but they said, and passed a resolution saying at the beginning of 2021, we will take that money from the 2021 budget, because this is the only way we know to try to keep them accountable to not going over their overtime. So that was somewhat of a win. And even that now they're trying to go back on. And so now that SPD has come back and called this a staffing crisis, again, despite the fact that they're fully funded to hire who they wanted to hire, they're trying to say, we need that money. And the substitute bill, 1199.81, would let them keep that money. Again, despite the fact that they're already fully funded for their hiring plan. And so this is the very first test of our defund wins, the fact that now that the attention has somewhat been pulled away, council and the mayor are trying to basically roll back those wins. So we can move on from this slide. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Sean Glaze for this one.
find the unmute. All right. So, yes, what got transferred out of SPD and why does it matter? So, last year we got the 911 dispatchers out. That was a big win, just like we heard earlier. Figuring out how to change dispatch and change that flow of information is really important strategy. We also got the parking enforcement officers transferred and domestic violence advocates. Why does this matter? So we know that the civilianization of SPD functions matters. We know that the more that we can shift the way that we invest in our public safety, community safety, the faster we can get to the place we want to go. So we're really shrinking how many employees are being controlled by SPD, being controlled by that culture of control and coercion. And so hopefully what that's going to do is that's going to really help our civilian 911 response to have dispatchers that are also fully civilianized. So again, really taking stock of our community safety, our public safety process here in Seattle means, really starting that transition now of bringing those into civilian positions and really scaling up community solutions. B1 investment. So yes, this is the most exciting part to me. We're really growing the world we need. So many people have been talking about how we need to do something different and wow, we need to put the money somewhere else and how are we going to do that? And spoiler alert, the answer is multifaceted. First thing is we won $12 million for immediate investments to scaling up community-based solutions. So that's non-police responses to harm. That is also investing in healing. There are over 87 applications received in order to really have community solutions go first and foremost. That's exciting, y'all. Like, this is a huge win that we've had so many people say, hey, I have this great idea of how we can invest in community safety and we can create it ourselves. And here's what it would look like. That's a big deal. So kudos to the community orgs, to the small nonprofits, to the LLCs, to everyone who went out and has made that first step possible. And kudos to the movement, including people on the ground, especially people on the ground, people making calls, people following up. Every little bit matters. So that's exciting. The next thing is participatory budgeting. If you have ever seen me, you've probably heard me say, hey y'all, I am Sean Glaze. I use they, them pronouns. And you've heard me talk about the research that went into participatory budgeting. So $30 million towards PB, which is the idea that we, the people, get to decide how public funds get spent. I'm going to speak a little slower because I'm remembering that this is helpful, especially from transcriptions. We, the people, we get to decide how the public funds get spent. And this year, the whole process was designed by Black and Brown community members who are most affected by systemic violence, like what we're talking about. We got to design the process for how that'll happen. And we gave it all to the city and a roadmap and said, here's how we want to do it. $18 million from that 30 million is money from the mayor's $100 million task force, or like, I don't want to say commitment, but $100 million the mayor said would go first to Black communities and then to BIPOC communities. And then $12 million is from SPD. So that is a huge win. This is the first year that SPD's budget has shrunk. Woo! We did that. And I have to say that if we keep this momentum going, this will be the first year, but not the last year. Again, having that sustained commitment. Awesome. And I can't remember who presents on this one.
This is Nikita.
Nikita! Woo, woo. I'll turn it over to Nikita Oliver.
Thanks, Sean. My name is Nikita Oliver. I use they, them pronouns. And I organize with No New Youth Jail, Free Them All Washington, which is a part of COVID-19 Mutual Aid. and Decriminalize Seattle. In my day job, I'm the executive director of Creative Justice, an arts-based healing engaged space for young people. And I just realized we have interpretation and I'm speaking really fast, so I'll slow down. And do work with numerous coalitions to build a world beyond prisons and police. We want to talk a little bit about our grounding. What is the analysis that Decriminalize Seattle and connected coalitions are doing this work around, and how do we view the future outcomes? The first of these is acknowledging that accountability reforms have failed, and that Seattle Police Department is functioning exactly as it's been designed to function, and the way that policing has been designed to function since its inception, and that no amount of reforms that has been proposed to fix the Seattle Police Department or the institution of policing has worked, because policing isn't broken. It's literally functioning the way that it was designed to. Our mayor consistently touts that the advances of the Seattle Police Department that have been made thus far have made SPD better. But in reality, we know that the violence continues. And last summer is a very clear example of that. Not just violence against community members when police are out on patrol, but also violence against protesters in the midst of a global pandemic and an economic recession. The history of policing in the United States is one of failure to curb police violence. Minneapolis, where the uprising began, had willingly adopted many best practices, and yet Derek Chauvin, who had undergone extensive training not long before murdering George Floyd, still committed this egregious act. Our mayor wants to believe that if we just identify and put in place, somehow enforce the right set of police procedures, police violence will end, but we know this isn't true. The first commission to investigate police brutality was in the late 1800s, and we continue to see the same recommendations being made 140 years later, because SPD is functioning as designed. And only with a fundamentally new approach to public safety can we actually ensure that everyone in our communities has safety. So the next point is that not every police function needs a civilian replacement. And by this, we mean that thinking about, do we really need to replace police on horseback? And considering how hard many of our students worked this summer to get school resource officers or police in schools out, we don't need to replace police in schools. So again, every police function does not need a civilian replacement. And while some level of unarmed 911 crisis response is necessary, we hold that meeting people's basic needs is really the best way to reduce the need for 911 and policing altogether. In our city, we are in a state of emergency around the housing affordability crisis, and many of our relatives who are living outside do not have opportunities to come inside if they want to. So ending homelessness is really one of the best replacements for the Seattle Police Department. Universal childcare, universal, accessible, culturally appropriate, full spectrum healthcare, clean water, good food, ensuring that we do the work of uprooting racial inequality and economic inequality. These are the things that actually will render policing as we know it obsolete. Police also do not guarantee public safety. Beyond meeting basic needs, we need to build out community responses that prevent harm and intervene when harm occurs, rather than simply responding in a reactionary way after harm has already happened. So divesting from the Seattle Police Department and ensuring that every person in Seattle is housed, fed, supported psychologically and physically will go a lot further towards creating public safety and public health for everyone. We also hold that real public safety means responding to harm in our community in ways that does not require an armed officer. Behavior that is typically classified as quote unquote violent crime makes up only about 1.3% of police responsibility, but is often used by city officials to justify current staffing levels. And we've seen this argument used many times in the Seattle City Council regarding this $5.4 million. And so we really need to push back against the notion that police are responding to violent crime, because we know statistically that behavior classified as quote unquote violent crime is only 1.3% of what Seattle Police Department is responding to. Even in cases where there is quote unquote violent crime, police rarely generate public safety. So they're mostly showing up reactionary or showing up after the fact, and often officers escalate or initiate violence, as has been demonstrated throughout the protests that we've seen, as was demonstrated in the police killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, as was demonstrated in terms of the murder of Charleena Lyles. And so I think it's very important that we understand that often police exacerbate pre-existing conditions, that they often actually expose people to violence. And so it's really important that we understand that the foundation here is that policing inherently does not guarantee public safety. Our goal is to reduce contact between police and the public as much as possible. We don't want a kinder, gentler form of policing. We both want to reduce the likelihood that people will ever have contact with police. We want to increase the safety that exists in our communities by meeting people's basic needs as a means of fully decreasing contact with police and the criminal punishment system. City officials spend lots of time talking about reducing 911 response times and touting efforts for improving community police relations. But for many of our communities, Black, Brown, Latinx, marginalized communities, reducing police response times does not actually increase or improve public safety, nor will the idea of quote unquote community policing efforts, which primarily focus on changing perceptions of police rather than the realities of the racist system we live in and racist criminalization and mass criminalization of many Black, Brown, Native, Latinx communities and low-income communities. It is significant that 32% of all uses of force and 27% of all instances of drawn firearms by the Seattle Police Department in 2019 were directed against Black peoples. And we make up 7% of the city's population. In particular, in the cases of Charleena Lyles and Sean Fuhr, these contacts were fatal. And so also acknowledging that we need to have mental health resources and resources that help to de-escalate situations in homes rather than calling in armed police, and also acknowledging that when armed police are called, especially on Black community members, they are more likely to result in someone being killed. And then our goal as a city where Black and other marginalized peoples live, that we are not controlled by threats of arrest, violence, or incarceration, and that instead we receive supports for our basic needs, but also repair and reparations, acknowledging the things that have caused the climate of the school to prison pipeline, over policing, and quote unquote violence in our communities is really at the root of this is historical trauma, is white supremacy, is economic inequality. And if we address those root causes, we can ensure much more safety for everyone in our community. City officials have done things like celebrating the recent hires of women and more officers of color as signs that the Seattle Police Department is moving in the right direction. We want to acknowledge that demographic shifts in who is a police officer does not change the root of what policing is or the way in which it impacts communities, especially marginalized communities, which have been historically and presently most subjected to over-policing, the school to prison pipeline, and mass incarceration. So just to bring those all together, our grounding and analysis is understanding that accountability reforms have failed, that Seattle police are functioning as designed. Not every police function needs to be replaced with a civilian replacement. Police do not guarantee public safety. And our goal is to reduce contact between police and public as much as possible. And our second goal is, as city where Black and Brown, Native, low-income communities, queer and trans folks aren't controlled by threats of arrest, violence, or incarceration, but rather have our needs met. So thank you so much, and I will pass it to the next presenter.
Yeah, it's me again. I realize I never introduced myself. My name is Angelica Cházaro, and I am in Decriminalize Seattle, and it's great to be here with you all. I see people naming all of the folks who have been lost to police violence, police murder in the chat, and this is part of what we are here to fight. We are here to say we will not go back. We will defund SPD. We cannot go back to the status quo of seeing a murderous police force have its budget grown every year and absorbing 1/4 of our city's general fund. That is simply not working. And so we want to take a second before we take a break to talk about the threats to defunding SPD and why we need to be pushing back. So now that we've seen these gains, now that we've derailed the train of a bloating SPD budget every year, SPD is not sitting back. The mayor is not sitting back. They're using every tool at their disposal to make the case to the general public about why, in fact, next year should be the year that we go back to $409 million or more in terms of the SPD budget. And so these are some of the ways they're doing that and some of the things that we need to be pushing back on. One is the use of the consent decree as a weapon to stop change. The consent decree, which was a tool that the Department of Justice, the federal Department of Justice used to try to get Seattle's police violence under control, is at this point somewhat of an outdated mechanism for the kinds of changes that we want to see. And in fact, SPD is using the consent decree as a reason not to change. So, you know, it borders to the ridiculous. So last summer, for example, when we were calling for the end of the horse cops, because, you know, what is that doing? Chief Best wrote a memo to council arguing that we needed horse cops because the consent decree says there have to be friendly cop community relationships, and the horse cops help that, you know. This is just not the case. We also know that the consent decree has actually resulted in huge investments in SPD. So they have now 5 times the training budget that they previously did, and we are still seeing family members murdered. This is not actually, you cannot train the anti-Black white supremacist violence out of policing, as Nikita was saying. We also see that the consent decree requires a lot of middle management, you know, more sergeants, more lieutenants, and that oftentimes these folks are themselves the ones with some of the greatest histories of violence. And so if you're not already following Divest SPD on Twitter or Instagram, I suggest you do. They're doing amazing work basically unearthing what's hidden in plain sight, which is that explicitly racist violent cops continue to be employed by SPD. Another big challenge to us right now is SPOG, the Police Officers Guild. This is an organization that is led by Mike Solon, a very open white supremacist sympathizer. And they are the organization who's going to be bargaining right now in this coming year with the city to try to get a new police contract that actually makes it harder to defund them, right? And so we're going to have to be putting a lot of pressure on those negotiations so that they don't end up with a contract that actually makes it harder to contract and eventually disappear our current police department. Then there's just sort of the big category of SPD propaganda, right? So the idea that they're in a staffing crisis, which we know they aren't, even council knows they aren't, because they are fully funded to hire the cops they want to hire this year, because we didn't win a no new cops last year. This idea also that they're pushing social workers or civilian employees as the solution to the problems that plague SPD. Part of the push that they're making for this $5.4 million is to have social workers assigned to follow along with cops, with the idea that they would somehow babysit the cops when there are mental health crises, and we'd end up with better outcomes. We don't need basically a mental health nav team. We know that model doesn't work. We don't need anyone employed with or co-responding with cops. We need a fully new paradigm. But SPD will be pushing their community service officers or social workers to be part of SPD because that grows their budget, when ultimately the main goal of SPD is to maintain their patrol budget and do what they've always done. And so we have to push back on the propaganda that if only we had the right community-based civilian people working within SPD, that would somehow change things. we also need to make sure that the people leaving SPD, civilians leaving SPD, like the domestic violence advocates, like the parking enforcement officers, actually take on a fully new paradigm in the way that they're working, so that they're not bringing the SPD habits into their new work. Finally, there's this idea that SPD can reform itself, right? The SPD is saying, how is it that we were not consulted in our own defunding when we are the experts in our own organization? That is something that we fully reject. We're saying, you know, you're not going to negotiate yourselves out of existence. You're not going to negotiate yourselves into being obsolete, but that's what we need right now. We need to be figuring out how to shift the city to make it obsolete. We don't need money, including hundreds of thousands of dollars that they asked for SPD to be running the community-based engagement that would lead to them being defunded. That's just not, it doesn't make sense. And then we'll have a report coming out about this early intervention system soon, but it's just something we wanted to mention because this is something that is required by the consent decree, something that the police is asking for more and more money for. And what it basically is the police look at who is most likely, they think, to be brutal, be racist, and then they try to give them more training and more intervention for which they receive overtime. That has not been proven to work in any city where it's been tried, and yet it's, again, the kind of language that SPD uses over and over again to justify expanding and trying to better themselves. So all of these things to us are part of defending the defund, as well as the fight for, as we said, to keep that $5.4 million out of SPD and keep that $5 million proviso in place so that more money can be coming out of SPD this year. And if we don't win these initial fights, it's going to be that much more difficult when we move into next fall's budget fight to see the defund continuing. And so on that note, we are not too far behind schedule, amazingly. If we can switch to the next slide and we can talk about the breakout group. So we've done a lot of talking, but we want folks who are here on the Zoom to be able to talk to each other. And so we've set up some breakout rooms on different topics. We'll have one on anti-Asian violence and massage parlor worker support. If you want to find out about the work that's being done by folks who are pushing back on anti-Asian violence and are also pushing back on expanding SPD's funding, go to that group. We'll have a group that's talking about labor's role. So you're a member of a union and are curious about labor's role in pushing back on the Seattle Police Officers Guild, go to Anna's group. We'll have a talking to your neighbors about police abolition. So maybe for you, this might be common sense, but the moment that you open your mouth and start talking to your neighbor, things very quickly break down. So you're trying to think of how to introduce these conversations on a neighbor to neighbor or family member or friend to friend basis, which is the only way we're gonna see, you know, this mass change we need. Go talk to Peter and Penny. Trey and Aretha are two people who have spent months and years on creative street tactics to actually push to create the world that we need and make it politically impossible for electeds to ignore us. So if you want to think about what it would take to hit the streets with them and other creative tactics, go to Back to the Streets. Sean gave you just a sneak peek, a preview of participatory budgeting, which is the citywide process that's going to be based in Black priorities that will redistribute the funds divested from SPD. So if you want to learn more about how to get involved in this, go to the PB breakout room. Nikita gave you just a glimpse of Abolition 101. Go to this breakout room. Actually, no, stay in this main room if you want to be part of Abolition 101. And the captioner will be staying here for that room. So if you're also wanting to stick with the captions, unfortunately, we could only apply them to one room, and this will be that room. So stay in this main room if you want some more of Abolition 101. Then there is a very active campaign right now by Divest SPD to stop money flowing from foundations, from Amazon, from Starbucks, from others, into the Seattle Police Department Foundation, which fund things like the stables for the cops and the training for all the bike cops who brutalize protesters. So if you want to think about those tactics of getting other folks in Seattle to divest from supporting SPD, then go to the Divest SPD group with Olivia. And finally, the fight that we are very engaged in currently right now for Defend the Defund is to have this no cop overtime bill around the $5.4 million be successful in the coming weeks. And so if you want to think more about how to do that work and plug into that work, you can plug in with BJ and Alice. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and take a 10-minute break now, but I maybe will pass this back to Sean to explain to folks how to go into the specific groups after our break.
Yes, after the break, you will have a chance to select your own breakout rooms, and we'll have someone to help We'll even have a breakout room for the Abolition 101 that'll be separate from the main room. Sorry, Angelica, forgot to mention. We were able to figure it out with the help of our captioner, Donna. Thank you so much. All right, so we're at a 10-minute break and we'll see y'all in a little bit.